The basket slipped, and she caught it against her hip with the kind of small The third, and the one she would have to keep telling all the way to the end of the long gravel drive, was her name. Mira, she had said at the gate. Mira, with no surname offered, because servants in this country were not asked for one, and because the surname she had been born with would have ended the conversation before it began. The gatekeeper, a thin man with a wet cough and a kind eye, had only nodded and waved her through, and now she was walking up an avenue of clipped limes toward a house she had been promised to since she was 9 years old, in a dress that did not belong to her, carrying a basket of winter pears she had bought that morning at the village market with the last coins in her purse. She had a quarter of an hour, by her own reckoning, before someone in the kitchens would ask who she was and why she had come, and she meant to spend that quarter of an hour learning the things she had ridden 3 days to learn, whether the man she was to marry in the spring was kind, whether he was cruel, whether he was anything at all. The carriages of her own household would arrive in 5 days with her trunks and her aunt, and a letter of formal presentation pressed in wax, and on the 6th day she would walk into this same hall in silk and pearls and be introduced as the future duchess, and from that hour forward she would never again hear a single honest word spoken about her husband in her own presence. She had a quarter of an hour. The basket bumped her hip. The gravel hissed under her shoes. A magpie watched her from a yew and declined to comment. She had rehearsed the curtsy on the floor of her rented room at the coaching inn until her knees ached, and the curtsy was the easy part. The hard part was the face. The face had to be the face of a girl who had never been spoken of in a single drawing room, who had never been measured for jewels, who had no opinions about the weather in the south of the country and had certainly never read a treaty. She had practiced that face in the inn's small clouded mirror and had found, with a small private surprise, that it suited her. Perhaps she had been wearing it for years and had not known. The house came into view between the limes in pieces. First the chimneys, then the long pale front, then the rows of windows, each one catching the wet winter light and giving it back changed. It was larger than she had imagined, and smaller than the maps in her father's study had suggested, which was, she thought, the way of every important place. She had imagined this house every winter for 9 years. She had imagined a hall with a black and white floor and a staircase that turned twice. She had imagined a man at the top of that staircase whose face she could not see. She had not, in any of those winters, imagined herself walking up to the kitchen door carrying pears. The kitchen door was at the side, down 3 shallow steps worn in the middle by a century of feet, and a girl in a flour-dusted apron opened it before Mira could knock and said, without surprise, "You're late." And Mira, who had been late for nothing in her life, said, "I beg your pardon," and stepped inside. The kitchen smelled of bread and onions and the faint iron tang of a great copper that had just been scrubbed. 2 women turned to look at her. A boy of perhaps 10 sat under the long deal table mending the strap of a basket and did not look up. The girl who had opened the door, who had a sharp, pretty face and the brisk competence of someone who had been managing a household before she was tall enough to reach the high shelf, took the basket from her without ceremony, glanced inside, sniffed, and said, "Pears. We asked for medlars." Mira, who had asked the fruit seller for medlars and been laughed at, said, "The market had none." The girl made a small noise that suggested the market was personally accountable to her and was failing in its duties. Then she looked at Mira properly for the first time, and Mira felt herself being read, the dress, the shoes, the hands, the way she stood. The girl's eyes were quick. They were not unkind. They were not yet decided. "Sit," the girl said, pointing to a stool by the hearth. "Eat! You'll be no use to anyone fainting." Mira sat. She had not realized she was tired until the warmth of the fire reached her knees, and then she was suddenly, dangerously tired, in the way of someone who has been holding a great many things up for a very long time and has just been told briefly that she may set one of them down. A piece of brown bread appeared at her elbow, and a wedge of pale, hard cheese, and a small cup of something hot that turned out to be cider with cloves in it. She ate slowly because she had learned that eating slowly was the most useful disguise of all, and she watched. She watched the boy under the table, who had hands far too careful for a boy of 10, and who was being allowed to mend a strap that any adult could have mended in half the time, which told her that someone in this kitchen had decided he must learn. She watched the older woman at the range, who moved as if her left hip pained her and who never once let that show in her face, which told her that someone in this house punished complaining and someone else, perhaps the same someone, rewarded endurance. She watched the sharp-faced girl, who was clearly the housekeeper or something very near it, and who had not yet asked Mira's name. That last fact she filed away with care. It meant the girl had decided either that her name did not matter yet, or that she already knew it and was waiting to see whether Mira would offer it freely. Either way, the quarter of an hour Mira had given herself had become, by the warmth of the cider and the patience of these strangers, an hour at least, perhaps more, and she would use it. She finished the bread and folded the cloth it had come in into a neat square, because she could not, even in disguise, leave a thing untidy, and the sharp-faced girl noticed, and her mouth moved at one corner in a way that was almost a smile, and was certainly an assessment. "Anna," the girl said, and held out a hand. Not to be shaken, but to take the empty cup. Mira gave her the cup and said, "Mira," and Anna nodded as if Mira were a parcel that had arrived without a label and would do for now. "You'll help in the still room this morning," Anna said. "The lavender wants stripping, and Sarah's hands are bad." Mira, who had stripped lavender exactly once in her life, at a convent garden when she was 12, said, "Yes." And Anna, who missed nothing, said, "You've done it before." "Once," Mira said, and Anna's mouth did the corner thing again. "Once is enough to know whether you ruined the leaves," she said, and led Mira out of the kitchen by a low door she had not noticed, down a flagged passage that smelled of beeswax and cold stone, past a row of bells on coiled springs, each labeled in a hand so neat it could only have been Anna's, into a small high room with a south window and a long table, and bundles of gray-purple stalks hanging from the beams in such quantity that the air itself was perfumed and slightly drunk. A woman of perhaps 40 sat at the table with her hands wrapped in linen, and this was Sarah, whose hands were bad, and who looked up at Mira with the calm, slightly amused suspicion of a person who has been replaced before by girls who did not last the week. Sarah did not greet her. Sarah said, "You'll do the bottom of the bundles first. The tops are for the tincture and want a finer hand." And Mira said, "Yes, ma'am," and sat down opposite her and began. The work was simple, and the work was not simple. The stalks had to be drawn between thumb and forefinger so that the small dry flowers fell into the wooden bowl without crushing, because crushing released the oil too early and the oil belonged in the tincture and not on her fingers, and within a minute Mira's fingertips were sticky and fragrant, and her shoulders had begun to soften in the way that shoulders soften when the hands are given an honest task. Anna stood in the doorway a moment longer than necessary watching her work, and then she went, and her footsteps receded down the flagged passage with the brisk neatness of a woman who had a list and was already on item 3. Sarah did not speak for some time. The light through the south window was the color of weak tea. A robin sat on the sill outside and considered them with the air of a small landlord. From somewhere above their heads a door closed, then opened, then closed again, and a man's voice said something short and a woman's voice answered, and then there was silence again. And Mira realized with a small cold start that the house was occupied at this hour, and that the man whose voice she had just heard might very well have been him. She kept her hands moving. She kept her face the practiced face. She let the silence hold. Sarah did not fill it. After a long while, Sarah said, without looking up, "You've not done this for pay before." It was not a question. Mira considered 3 answers and chose the one closest to the truth. "No," she said. Sarah nodded once, as if a small private bet had been settled in her favor. "You stripped them right, though," she said. "Whoever taught you was patient." "A nun," Mira said, before she could stop herself. And then, because a nun was perhaps too specific, added, "At the village school." Sarah's mouth, like Anna's, did the corner thing. There were a great many corner things in this house, Mira thought. They were the smiles of people who had learned that full smiles were expensive. Sarah said, "The nuns in this country teach girls to embroider. They do not teach them to strip lavender for the still." Mira's hands did not stop. She said, "This nun was unusual." Sarah said, and let it lie there between them like a coin neither of them would pick up, and they worked on. The bundle in Mira's hand grew thin, then bare, and she set the naked stalks aside in the pile Sarah had begun, and reached for another. And as she reached the door at the far end of the still room opened without a knock, and a man came in. He was not the Duke. She knew this before her eyes had finished placing him, because she had been told, in the careful way that mothers tell daughters such things, that the Duke was 28 and dark and slight, and this man was perhaps 40 and broad and red-faced, and dressed in the soft good clothes of an upper servant who had been given the run of a house for so long that he had begun to think of it as his. He had a ring of keys at his belt. He had the particular smile of a man who used charm as a tax. He looked at Sarah and said, "How are the hands today, Sarah?" in a voice that was meant to sound concerned and managed, instead, to sound like a man counting the days until he could replace her. Sarah said, "The same, Mr. Latimer," and did not look up. Mr. Latimer's eyes moved to Mira. They stayed on her a beat too long. Mira, who had spent her life under such gazes and had learned to be uninteresting under them, lowered her own to her work and let her shoulders round a 1/4 inch and let her mouth go slightly slack and became, in that small adjustment, a girl of no consequence. "New," he said. "Anna engaged her this morning," Sarah said. "She'll do for the lavender while my hands mend." Mr. Latimer made a small humming sound in his throat. He said, "His lordship is particular about who is in the house." Sarah said, "His lordship is at the home farm until noon and has never, in my memory, asked who stripped his lavender." Mr. Latimer's smile thinned. He said, "All the same, see me at the noon bell, girl, and bring your papers." Mira, who had no papers, said, "Yes, sir," and he stood another moment in the door, surveying the still room as if it were a province in his keeping, and then he went. The door closed. Sarah waited until his footsteps were well down the passage, and then she said, very quietly, without looking up, "You have no papers." It was not a question either. Mira's hands kept moving. She said no. Sarah said, "Then at the noon bell you will go to the dairy on an errand for me, and you will be very thorough about it, and you will not return to this room until I send for you, and you will not be in any passage where Mr. Latimer is, and tomorrow we will see." Mira looked up. Sarah was still working, calm as a pond. "Why?" Mira said. "Because she had to know." And Sarah said, "Because you stripped them right, and because that man would dismiss a girl for the pleasure of it, and because I have not yet decided what you are, but I have decided you are not what he thinks you are." The robin on the sill flew off. The light in the still room shifted a finger's width along the wall. Mira said, "Thank you." Sarah said, "Don't thank me yet. We have not seen noon." They worked on in the lavender silence, and Mira, who had come to learn what kind of man her future husband was, began to understand that she would first have to learn what kind of house she was walking into, because a house, she was being shown, was not the man at the top of the staircase. A house was the man at the still room door, with the ring of keys, and the woman with the bad hands who kept the small ones safe, and the sharp girl in the kitchen with the list, and the boy under the table being taught to mend a strap properly because someone had decided he must be taught. She had imagined, all those winters, a husband. She had not imagined a household. She set the thought down carefully, as one sets down a hot cup, and reached for the next bundle. The noon bell, when it came, was not a bell at all, but a long iron triangle struck 3 times in the yard, and Mira was already gone. Sarah had sent her with a stoneware jug and a list of 3 small lies to tell at the dairy if anyone asked. And Mira had walked out of the still room by the garden door and across the wet kitchen garden, where the cabbages stood in their dark green rosettes, like a regiment that had given up marching, and through a gate in the wall into an orchard where the bare apple trees made a pattern of black branches against the pale sky. And she had taken her time, because Sarah had told her to be thorough, and because being out of doors with cold air on her face was the first relief she had felt since the coach had set her down at the village inn. The dairy was at the far end of the orchard, half sunk into the slope of a small hill so that its north wall was cool earth and its south wall was whitewashed stone, and inside it was so cold that her breath stood in the air, and so clean that she felt suddenly aware of her own dusty hem. A girl was skimming cream. She was perhaps 14, with a quiet, round face and the kind of stillness that some children have when they have been told from very early on that no one will hold them if they cry. She looked at Mira and said, "You're for the buttermilk," and Mira, who had been told to ask for buttermilk, said yes and held out the jug. The girl filled it slowly, not because she was slow, but because she had been taught to measure, and as she filled it, she said, without looking up, "You're the new one." Mira said, "Yes." The girl said, "Anna says you'll do, and Sarah says you'll do, so you'll do." The verdict was delivered with such unself-conscious authority that Mira almost laughed, and the girl, hearing the small movement of breath, glanced up, and her own mouth moved at the corner, and Mira thought, "The corner thing is taught here. It is passed from one to the next. It is the household's private language." "What is your name?" Mira said, and the girl said, "Bess," and went back to her skimming. There was a stool by the door. Mira, remembering Sarah's instruction to be thorough, sat on it. She watched Bess work. She watched the long wooden skimmer come down on the cream and lift it in a thin yellow sheet. And she watched Bess flick the sheet into a second crock with a small turn of the wrist. And she watched the way Bess's mouth moved silently as she counted 1, 2, 3, 4, and Mira realized that Bess was counting because Bess could not yet trust her hands to know when the cream was thin enough, and that counting was, in this house, the way one was permitted not to know. She filed this away too. After a while, Bess said, without looking up, "He's in the yard." Mira's heart did one quick, clean knock against her ribs, the way a horse knocks once against a stall when it has heard a sound it does not yet understand. And then she breathed and was still. "Who?" she said. Because to ask directly would have been wrong. And Bess said, "His lordship. He came back early. He is looking at the bay mare's foot." Mira said, "Oh," in the voice of a girl to whom this was only news. And Bess said, "You can see him from the high window if you stand on the churn lid," and the offer was made so plainly and with so little expectation that it could only have been a kindness. And Mira understood that Bess had decided, in her quiet way, that the new girl wanted to see the master, and that there was no harm in it because every new girl did. Mira stood on the churn lid. She did not put her face to the high window. She put only her eyes above the sill, the way she had been taught, very long ago, to look over a wall when one was small and curious, and did not wish to be seen. And she looked down into the cobbled yard where a man was crouched beside a bay mare with his back to the dairy. He had taken off his coat and laid it across the mare's back as if it were a blanket, which it was not meant to be, and he was holding the mare's near foreleg in his hands, and he was speaking to her. Mira could not hear the words. She could see only that he was speaking to the horse with the slow, steady cadence of a person who is not in a hurry and who is not afraid, and that the mare, who had been fretting, had set her ears at half-mast and was leaning, just perceptibly, into his shoulder. A groom stood 3 paces off with a rasp in his hand, waiting to be told. The man at the mare's foot did not tell him anything for a long moment. He only ran his thumb along the inside of the hoof, and then set it down, very gently, on the cobbles, and stood, and put a hand on the mare's neck, and only then turned his head, and said something to the groom, and the groom nodded, and came forward. Mira could not see his face. She could see the line of his shoulder under the white shirt, and the dark hair at the back of his neck where it met his collar, and the small economy of his movements, and these things together told her 3 things at once. He was not a heavy man. He had not raised his voice. He had taken off his good coat for a horse. She got down from the churn lid. Bess was watching her with the patient air of someone willing to wait out a small ceremony. "Well," Bess said, Mira said, "he speaks kindly to his horses." Bess considered this. She said, "He speaks kindly to most things." Then she added, with the precision of a child who has learned to be exact because the adults around her are exact, except to Mr. Latimer. Mira said, "Oh," Bess said, "but only when Mr. Latimer deserves it, which is often." Mira said, "Bess," and Bess said, Mira said, "How long has Mr. Latimer been here?" Bess said, "Since before me. He was here when his lordship's father was alive. He was here when his lordship was a boy. He was here when the old duke died, and his lordship came back from the war. He was here when the lawyers came about the marriage." Mira's hand, which had been at her side, closed very slightly, and she made it open again. "The marriage," she said, in the voice of a girl who had heard a piece of gossip and wanted more. Bess said, the northern marriage. Mira said, There was a small pause. Bess set down the skimmer. She wiped her hands on her apron with the unhurried thoroughness of a child who had decided to say something and was preparing to say it well. She said, "They say she is very proud." Mira's breath did not change. She said, "Do they?" Bess said, "Mr. Latimer says it. He says it often. He says she will come in the spring with 12 trunks and a French maid and a dog she does not like, and that she will look at the house and find it small, and at the people and find them rough, and at his lordship and find him quiet, and that she will be displeased with all of us, and that we shall have to learn new ways. He says, we shall have to learn to speak French at table. He says her father is a hard man and her mother is a colder one, and she is the daughter of both, and the granddaughter of a woman who put 3 girls out of the house for laughing in chapel." Mira had to set her hand on the cool, whitewashed wall because the cool, whitewashed wall was the only thing in the room that was not, at that moment, moving. The grandmother in chapel was true. The grandmother in chapel had been her own grandmother, dead these 6 years, and the story of the 3 girls was a story Mira had heard at her grandmother's knee, told as a moral lesson, with the moral being that one did not laugh in chapel. And to hear it now from a 14-year-old dairymaid in the mouth of Mr. Latimer was to understand, with a clarity so cold and so complete that it stopped her breath, that Mr. Latimer had a correspondent in her own father's house. Someone in her household was writing to him. Someone in her household had been writing to him for a long time. She did not know yet whether her father knew. She did not know yet whether the Duke knew. She knew only that the portrait of herself that had been carried, letter by letter, into this kitchen and this dairy and this still room for months, perhaps for years, was the portrait of a cold, proud girl with 12 trunks, and that the people in this house, who were good people, who taught small boys to mend straps and protected women with bad hands and spoke kindly to horses, had been preparing themselves with a quiet, collective dread for her arrival. She made her voice ordinary. She said, "And what does his lordship say?" Bess said, "His lordship does not say." Mira said, "Never." Bess said, "Once." Mira waited. Bess, who had inherited from somewhere the storyteller's instinct for the held beat, picked up the skimmer again and ran it once across the cream before she went on. "Once," she said. "In the autumn, Mr. Latimer was at the table in the steward's room, and he was talking about her, the northern bride, and he was saying she would not suit, and his lordship was passing in the passage, and he stopped, and he put his head in at the door, and he said, 'Latimer, you have never met the lady.' And Mr. Latimer said, 'No, my lord, but one hears.' And his lordship said, 'One hears a great many things in this house, Latimer, and most of them are not true, and the ones that are true are not yours to repeat.' And then he went," Mira said. "And then," Bess said, "and then nothing. Mr. Latimer was quieter for a week. Then he began again." Mira stood very still in the cold of the dairy, with her hand on the whitewashed wall, and she felt the small, clean knock of her heart again, twice this time, and she understood that she had been given, in less than a morning, more honest information about her future husband than 9 years of letters and lawyers and her mother's careful descriptions had ever provided. He spoke kindly to horses. He had defended her once, sight unseen, in his own steward's room, and then had not pressed the point, because he was a man who said a thing once and did not repeat himself. He had not, in all the months since, told Mr. Latimer to be silent on the subject of her, which meant either that he did not know Mr. Latimer was still speaking, which seemed unlikely in a house where every bell was labeled in Anna's neat hand, or that he had decided, for reasons of his own, to let the household form whatever opinion it would form and to wait. To wait, Mira thought, for her, to see whether the cold, proud girl arrived or whether someone else did. She took her hand off the wall. She said, "Thank you for the buttermilk, Bess." And Bess said, And Mira walked out of the dairy into the orchard with the jug in her hands and the cold air on her face and a calm in her chest that she had not expected, because she had come up the drive that morning to learn whether her future husband was kind, and she had learned instead that he was watchful and that watchful, in a house like this one, was perhaps the better of the two. She did not go back to the still room. She went instead the long way round the orchard wall to a small wooden door she had noticed on her way out, the kind of door that gardeners use, half hidden by a tangle of last year's bryony, and she stood for a moment with her hand on its rough wood and let herself think. The jug of buttermilk was heavy in her other hand. The wind moved the bare branches above her with a small dry sound like a turning page. She had perhaps another hour, perhaps two, before Anna came looking for her, or before Mr. Latimer came looking for her, or before the household, in its quiet, competent way, decided what to do with her. She would have to make a choice within that hour. She could keep the disguise. She could strip Lavender and fetch buttermilk for a day or two more and learn what else there was to learn, and then she could slip away before her own carriages arrived and present herself at the front door on the 6th day in silk and pearls and pretend she had never been here. Or she could go to him now. She could walk around to the stable yard with the jug in her hand and stand in the cobbled square and wait until he turned, and she could tell him who she was. She thought about the second choice for a long moment. She thought about the look on his face. She thought about the look on Anna's face when she learned, and on Sarah's face, and on Bess's, and she thought, with a small cold honesty, that she did not yet want to give them that look. They had been kind to her without knowing who she was, and kindness given to a stranger was a different and rarer thing than kindness given to a duchess, and she wanted, very much, to keep the first kind in her hands a little longer before she traded it for the second. She also thought, more practically, that she did not yet know enough. She knew that he spoke kindly to horses and that he had defended her once. She did not yet know what he did when he was tired. She did not yet know what he did when he was crossed. She did not yet know whether the patience he showed the bay mare was a patience he extended to people or only to creatures who could not answer him back. She had been raised by a father who was charming in public and exacting in private, and she had learned, by the time she was 12, that the only honest hour in her father's day was the hour before breakfast, when he thought no one was watching, and that everything after that hour was performance. She wanted, before she made herself known, to see her Duke in his hour before breakfast. She opened the small wooden door. It gave onto a narrow grass walk between two yew hedges, and the grass walk gave onto a wider gravel path. And the wider gravel path, she realized with a small lift of the heart, led back to the kitchen yard by a route that did not pass the stable. She would deliver the buttermilk, she would go back to the still room, she would strip Lavender until the light went, and she would sleep where the household put her, and she would watch. She walked the grass walk slowly, because Sarah had told her to be thorough, and because she wanted, now, to be seen by no one for a small while, and at the end of the yew hedges, she came out into a part of the garden she had not seen before. A sunken square with a stone basin in the middle and a sundial on a low pillar and 4 stone benches set at the 4 sides, and on one of the benches a man was sitting. He had his back to her. He had a book open on his knee and was not reading it. He was looking at the stone basin, in which there was no water at this season, and at the sundial, on which there was no sun at this hour, and he was sitting very still in the particular way that people sit when they have come outside to think, and have discovered that thinking outside is no easier than thinking in. He had not heard her on the grass. She had perhaps 3 seconds to decide. She could step back into the yew walk and he would never know she had been there. She could go forward and curtsy, and pass him on her way to the kitchen, and he would see only a maid with a jug. She could speak. She did not yet know which of the 3 she would do when she did the 4th thing, which was to stand exactly where she was and look at the back of his head, the dark hair at the collar, the line of the shoulder under the dark coat he had put on again, the hand resting on the open page, long-fingered and very still. He said without turning, "You walk quietly." Mira's breath caught and held. She had not made a sound, she was sure of it. He went on, in the same quiet voice, in no hurry, as if he were continuing a conversation she had already begun. "The gardeners come past at this hour with the barrows. They do not walk on the grass. They take the gravel. You are not one of the gardeners." Mira found her voice. She said, "No, my lord." He turned his head, then, only a little, only enough to see her at the edge of his sight, and she saw his face for the first time. He was not handsome in the way her mother had described, which had been a careful, social way, all forehead and bearing. He was something quieter than handsome. He had a long mouth that did not, at this moment, do anything at all, and gray eyes that were the color of the stone basin, and a small, thin scar at the edge of his jaw that she had not been told about, and that she found, absurdly, comforting, because it meant her mother had not seen him recently, which meant that this man had been allowed, by the world, to be a private person for at least a little while. He looked at her. He looked at the jug. He looked at the apron. He looked at her hands, which were faintly purple at the tips from the lavender, and at her shoes, which were good shoes, better than a kitchen maid's shoes, and which she had been a fool not to scuff before she came. He did not, however, look at her face for very long, and she understood with a small, precise gratitude that he was a man who had been taught not to stare at women in his employ. He said, "You came up from the kitchen." She said, "Yes, my lord." "From the dairy, my lord." "With buttermilk for Mrs. Sarah's tincture." He said, "Ah," and she could not tell from the single syllable whether he believed her or whether he was choosing, for reasons of his own, to behave as if he did. He said, "You are new." She said, "Yes, my lord." "This morning." He said, "What is your name?" She said, "Mira, my lord." He said, "Only Mira." She said, "Only Mira, my lord," and she did not know, until she had said it, that her voice would not shake. He looked at the sundial. He said, "Mira is a name from the south." She said, "My mother was from the south, my lord," which was true, and which was the first true thing she had said in this garden, and which surprised her, because she had not intended to give him anything true. He said, in a way that was very like Bess and very like Sarah, and she understood, with a small turn of the heart, that the corner thing and the had not been taught downward through the household from Anna. They had been taught downward through the household from him. He said, "You are cold." She said, "No, my lord." He said, "Your hands are blue." He stood up then, with the same small economy she had seen in the stable yard, and he took off the dark coat he had just put on, and he held it out to her, not over her shoulders, which would have been a familiarity, but across his own forearm, as one offers a thing to a guest. He said, "Take it to the kitchen with you. Tell Anna I said the still room is to have a brazier from today. Tell Sarah her hands are to be looked at this evening by Mr. Hollis when he comes for the mare. Tell Mr. Latimer nothing." Mira took the coat. It was warm from him and smelled, very faintly, of horses and of the cold air of the yard, and underneath those of something dry and clean, like old paper. She held it across her arm as he had held it across his. She said, "Yes, my lord." He sat down again, slowly, and opened his book at a different page, and she understood that she had been dismissed, and that the dismissal was a kindness, because he had given her a moment in which to leave without being looked at, and she took it. She walked the gravel this time, not the grass, because she did not want him to be able to say of her, later, that she had walked quietly twice. At the gate into the kitchen garden, she stopped and looked back. Once. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the sundial again, as he had been when she came, but his shoulders had changed. They had come down a 1/4 inch. He was, she thought, fractionally less alone in the garden than he had been 10 minutes before, and she did not know whether to be glad of that or afraid. In the kitchen, Anna took the coat from her without expression and hung it on a peg by the door as if Duke's coats arrived on Maid's arms every afternoon. And then she said, "The brazier." Mira said, "His lordship says the still room is to have a brazier from today." Anna said, Mira said, "And Mr. Hollis is to look at Sarah's hands this evening when he comes for the mare." Anna said, Mira said, "And I am to tell Mr. Latimer nothing." Anna's eyes came up at that, and they were sharp and bright and entirely amused, and for the first time the corner thing widened into something that was almost a smile. She said, "You've met his lordship, then?" Mira said, "In the sunken garden." He spoke first. Anna said, "He does that." Mira said, "Does what?" Anna said, "Speaks first to the ones he does not know yet. He says it is only fair, since he has the advantage of the house." Then she said, more briskly, "You'll sleep in the small room over the still room. Bess will bring you a blanket. Supper is at 7 in the hall, and you sit at the bottom by the door, which is the new girl's seat, and you do not speak unless Sarah speaks to you, and you do not look at Mr. Latimer at all, because he likes to be looked at and we are not, at present, indulging him. Mira said, yes. Anna said, and Mira. Mira said, yes. Anna said, his lordship gave you his coat. Mira said, only to carry. Anna said, And then, quietly, without looking at her, he has not given anyone his coat to carry since his mother died. Mira did not answer. Anna did not seem to expect her to. Anna went out with her list, and her footsteps receded down the passage with their brisk neatness, and Mira stood for a moment in the warm kitchen with the smell of bread and onions and the faint perfume of lavender still on her hands, and she thought, I have 4 days. She thought, I have 4 days in which to be Mira, and on the 5th day my aunt will arrive at the village inn with a letter in wax, and on the 6th day I will walk in at the front door in silk, and the look on Anna's face will not be the look she has just given me, and the look on Sarah's face will not be the look she gave me over the lavender, and the look on Bess's face will not be the look she gave me at the dairy, and the look on his face. The look on his face she could not yet imagine, because she did not yet know which of the 3 things he was, the man who spoke kindly to horses, or the man who defended absent women once and then waited, or the man who gave his coat to a maid he had never seen before because her hands were blue. She thought, perhaps he is all 3. She thought, perhaps that is what watchful means. She took up her basket again and went back to the still room, and Sarah looked up at her with the small, slightly amused suspicion she had worn that morning, and the suspicion was a quarter less than it had been, and Sarah said, you were thorough, and Mira said, yes, ma'am, and sat down opposite her and reached for the next bundle of lavender, and as her fingers closed on the dry stalks she heard, far off in the house, the long iron triangle being struck for the half-hour, and she counted the strikes. 1, 2, the way Bess counted the cream, because counting was, in this house, the way one was permitted not to know. The next 3 days went by in the particular slow way that days go by when one is paying attention. Mira stripped lavender in the morning, and helped Bess in the dairy after the noon bell, and learned, from Sarah, how to bind a bundle of dried hyssop without bruising it, and how to write a label in a hand that was not her own, because her own hand was the hand of a girl who had been taught penmanship by a tutor and would have given her away in a stroke. She learned the names of the bells in the passage. She learned that the boy under the table was called Tom, and was the son of a tenant who had died in the autumn, and had been taken in by Anna without consultation and without fuss. She learned that the old woman at the range was called Mrs. Penn and had been in the kitchen since the old Duke was a child, and that her hip pained her in the wet, and that no one was permitted to mention it because Mrs. Penn had decided at some point in the last decade that to be pitied was worse than to be in pain. She learned that Mr. Latimer had a small parlor to himself on the ground floor, where he kept a writing desk and a locked drawer and a decanter of port that he did not share, and that he wrote letters in that parlor for an hour every morning and an hour every evening, and that the letters were taken to the village post by a boy who was paid in copper to be discreet, and who was, Anna had told her with the corner thing fully deployed, not discreet at all, and reported faithfully to Anna every Friday in exchange for a slice of pie. She learned, in other words, that Anna ran the house, and that his lordship knew Anna ran the house, and that Mr. Latimer thought he ran the house, and that this arrangement had held for some years, and would hold a little longer, because none of the 3 of them, at present, had any reason to break it. She did not see his lordship again, not properly, for 2 of those days. She saw him at a distance, crossing the yard with a steward, riding out at dawn with 2 dogs at his stirrup, standing at a window on the first landing in the early dusk, with his hands in his pockets looking down at the avenue of limes, as if he were counting the trees, and she watched him each time with the calm, sustained attention of a person who has decided that watching is, for the moment, more useful than being seen. On the 3rd evening, however, the bell at the still room door rang once, sharp and bright, and Sarah looked up from her work and said, "His lordship," and Mira's heart did the clean knock again, and Sarah said, "Go." Mira went. He was in the long passage outside the steward's room, and he had a candle in one hand because the early dusk had filled the house already, and he said, without preamble, Mira, Mrs. Penn's hip is bad tonight. There is a tincture in the still room in the small green bottle on the third shelf. Sarah will tell you which. Take it to her in the kitchen and stay until she has drunk it, because she will not drink it if no one stays. He said this the way he had spoken to the mare, slowly and steadily and without hurry, and she said, "Yes, my lord," and he said, "And Mira," and she said, "Yes, my lord," and he said, "Thank you," which was a thing. She realized later that no master in her father's house had ever said to a servant in her hearing, and which he had said now with such ordinary courtesy that he plainly did not know it was unusual. She took the tincture to Mrs. Penn. Mrs. Penn drank it under protest, scowling with the air of a woman who had been ambushed by kindness and resented it on principle. And then, when it was down, she looked at Mira over the rim of the cup and said, "You've a good face, girl." Mira said, "Thank you, ma'am." Mrs. Penn said, "Don't thank me. It wasn't a compliment. A good face is a thing that gets used." Mira said, "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Penn said, and shut her eyes, and Mira sat by her in the warm kitchen until her breathing evened, and then she got up quietly and went out, and in the passage, she nearly walked into Mr. Latimer. He had been standing in the dark just beyond the kitchen door. He had been listening. She knew this because he stepped back too quickly, and because his smile, when he turned it on, was the smile of a man who has been caught and is pretending he has not. He said, "The new girl, about at this hour. With his lordship's tincture, I see." He had not seen the tincture, because she had left the empty cup with Mrs. Penn. He had only heard. He said, "You have not been to see me about your papers." She said, "No, sir. I have been about Sarah's work." He said, "Sarah's work, is it? And his lordship's coat, the other day. And his lordship's voice in the passage just now." A great deal of his lordship's attention for a girl with no papers. He stepped closer. The passage was narrow. He smelled of port and of the dry indoor smell of a man who did not go out enough. He said, "Who sent you here?" Mira's mouth was dry. She said, "No one sent me, sir. I came for the work." He said, "You are not a kitchen girl. I have eyes. Your hands are too fine and your back is too straight, and you say, 'Yes, sir,' like a girl who has been taught to say it, and not like a girl who has had to learn." He said, "Who do you write to?" Mira understood, with a small, cold lift of the hairs at the back of her neck, that Mr. Latimer believed she was a correspondent, not his correspondent. Someone else's. He believed someone in another great house had sent a girl into this kitchen to watch him as he had been watching her, and the fear on his face, under the smile, was the fear of a man who has been doing a thing for a long time and has just imagined, for the first time, that someone might be doing it back. She did not, in that moment, plan what she did. She only knew very clearly that the truth would end her 4 days, and that a lie would end them faster, and that the only thing left was a third thing. She straightened her back, which she had been holding deliberately rounded for 3 days, and she let her face become, for a single breath, the face she had been born with. And she said, in a voice that was her own, "I write to no one, Mr. Latimer. But I read a great deal, and I have read, lately, that a steward who writes 2 letters a day and shares his port with no one is generally writing about his employer, and that such letters are paid for, in the end, by whoever reads them, and that the price is rarely what the steward expected." Mr. Latimer's face did a thing. It went, briefly, the color of the whitewashed wall in the dairy. Then it went red. Then it composed itself, because he was, after all, a man who had survived in this house for 30 years. And he said, very softly, "You are a strange kitchen maid." Mira said, "Yes, sir. I have been told so." And she stepped past him, neatly, the way Anna stepped past things, and she walked down the passage without hurrying, and she did not look back. And behind her she heard him stand a long moment in the dark before his footsteps went, at last, the other way. In the still room, Sarah looked up from her work and said, "You are pale." And Mira said, "I have just been unwise." And Sarah said, with the first true smile Mira had seen from her, "Good. We were beginning to think you never would be." That night, in the small room, over the still room, Mira lay on a narrow bed under a blanket Bess had brought her. and she watched the square of moonlight move slowly across the ceiling, and she thought about her 4 days, which had become 2. She thought about her aunt arriving at the village inn the day after tomorrow with the letter in wax. She thought about the silk and the pearls. She thought about the look on Anna's face when the front door opened and the cold, proud girl with 12 trunks turned out to be the new girl from the still room, and she found, to her own surprise, that the thought no longer frightened her in the way it had that afternoon in the orchard. It frightened her differently. It frightened her the way a true thing frightens, not the way a lie does. She thought about him. She thought about the long mouth that did not do anything, and the gray eyes the color of the stone basin, and the small scar at the edge of his jaw, and the hand on the open page that had been so still. She thought about the coat across her arm and the smell of horses and old paper. She thought about the way he had said her name. Mira. Only Mira. As if only Mira were enough, she thought. He knows. She did not know how she knew, and she did not yet entirely believe it, but the thought arrived in her in the small hours with the quiet certainty of a thing remembered rather than guessed. He knows, and he is waiting. He is waiting to see what I do. He is waiting to see whether I tell him myself, or whether I let my aunt tell him on the 6th day in silk, or whether I leave in the morning before either and slip back to the inn and become, on the 6th day, the girl Mr. Latimer has been describing in his letters, and never let him see that for 4 days I was someone else. He is waiting, she thought, the way he waited in the stable yard with his hand on the mare's neck, slowly and steadily and without hurry, to see what I will choose. She did not sleep much. Toward dawn, she got up and dressed and went down to the still room, because she had decided, in the way that decisions are sometimes made for one in the dark, that she would tell him today, and that she would tell him in the sunken garden, and that she would tell him before the household woke, because she did not want Anna's face, or Sarah's face, or Bess's face, to be the first faces that learned, and she did not want Mr. Latimer's face to be a face that learned at all until later. She lit a candle. She wrote a small note to Sarah in the disguised hand she had practiced, saying she had gone for hyssop and would be back by the bell, and she put it on the table under the wooden bowl. She put on her shawl. She went out by the garden door. The world was the color of pewter, and the air smelled of cold grass and of the wood smoke that rose, very thinly, from the chimney over the kitchen, where Anna was already, no doubt, on item 1 of her list. Mira walked across the kitchen garden where the cabbages stood in their dark regiments, and through the gate into the orchard where the apple trees waited. And she did not walk to the dairy or to the small wooden door behind the bryony. She walked straight along the orchard path to the yew hedge that fenced the sunken garden, and she let herself in by the narrow grass walk, and she came out into the square with the stone basin and the sundial and the 4 stone benches. And he was there. He was sitting on the same bench as before. There was no book on his knee this morning. There was only his hands, folded loosely, and his eyes on the sundial, on which there was no sun yet, because the sun had not risen, and she understood that he had been there since before she came down, and that he had been waiting, perhaps, since long before that. He did not turn his head when she came in. He said in the same quiet voice as before, "You walk quietly." Mira's throat closed and then opened. She said, "My lord, I have something to tell you." He said, "Sit down." There was a bench opposite his, across the dry basin. She sat. The stone was cold through her dress. She put her hands flat on it because she did not know what else to do with them. He looked, at last, at her face. And his gray eyes were patient, and not unkind, and not entirely calm. And she saw for the first time that he was as afraid as she was, and that he had been afraid for some days, perhaps for some weeks, perhaps since the autumn, when his steward had begun, in the steward's room, to describe the woman he had not yet met. She said, "My lord, I came up the drive 4 days ago with a basket of pears, and I told the gatekeeper my name was Mira, and it is my name, but it is not the only one." He said, "No," she said, "my lord, I am." She had to stop. The sundial was very near her hand. The stone basin was very near her hand. The small, thin scar at the edge of his jaw was very near her hand. She started again. She said, I am the lady you are to marry in the spring." He closed his eyes. He did not close them in the way a man closes his eyes when he has heard bad news. He closed them in the way a man closes his eyes when a long-held breath has, at last, been let out. He opened them again. He said, "I thought so." She said, "When?" He said, "On the gravel, the first afternoon. I saw your shoes." She said, "My shoes." He said, "Your shoes were good shoes, and they were not scuffed. A girl who had walked from the village in those shoes would have scuffed them. You had come from the inn, where someone had cleaned them for you the night before. I thought then that you might be a runaway from a great house, of which there are many in this country. I did not think, at first, that you might be mine." She said, "When did you think it?" He said, "In the sunken garden. When I asked you your name and you said Mira. My mother's name was Mira." She said, "Oh." He said, "My mother was from the south." She said, "My mother was from the south." He said, "Yes." He said, "I knew then, but I did not know what to do with knowing, because I did not know why you had come, and I did not want to ask you in the garden in case the asking made you go." He said, "So I waited." She said, "Why did you wait?" He looked at her steadily. He said, "Because I have been told for 9 years that you are proud, and I did not believe it, but I did not know. And because I have been told for 9 years that you do not want this marriage, and I did not believe that either, but I did not know. And because it seemed to me, when I saw you on the grass, that you had come to learn the same things about me. And it seemed to me that if I let you learn them, you might learn them better than if I told you." She said, "My lord." He said, "My name is Edmund. Say it once, please, so I know you can." She said, "Edmund?" He said, "Thank you." He said, "Mira." She said, "Yes." He said, "What did you learn?" She had to think about this. She had thought she knew in the dark what she had learned, but in the pale dawn with his gray eyes on her, she found that the list she had made in her head was not the list she wanted to give him. She said, "I learned that you speak kindly to horses." He said, "That is a low standard." She said, "It is not. I have been in houses where it was not met." He was silent. She said, "I learned that you defended me once in the steward's room and then did not press the point, because you are a man who says a thing once." He said, "You have been talking to Bess." She said, "Bess does not gossip. She reports." He said, "That is true." She said, "I learned that Mr. Latimer has been writing to someone in my father's house for a long time, and that the someone is telling him things about me that are designed to make this household afraid of my coming." He said, "I know." She said, "You know," he said, "I have known for some months. I have not yet decided what to do, because the someone in your father's house is, I think, your father's secretary, who has been my godfather's friend since they were boys, and to dismiss him I must first speak with my godfather, and my godfather is at present in Vienna, and these things take time." She said, "Oh." He said, "Also, I confess, I wanted to wait until I had met you, because if you had turned out to be the woman Latimer described, I should not have had to do anything." She said, "And if I had," he said, "I should have married you anyway, because we are pledged, and because I do not believe a pledge is unmade by being inconvenient. But I should not have given you my coat in the sunken garden." She laughed. It was a small laugh, very surprised, and it was the first sound of its kind that she had made in the 4 days, and he heard it, and his long mouth did, at last, a thing. It moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the beginning of one, and he stopped it before it could be more, because, she understood, he was a man who did not yet trust the morning. She said, "Edmund?" He said, "Yes." She said, "I learned also that this is a good house." He said, "It is not yet, but it is becoming one." She said, "Anna runs it." He said, "Anna runs it. Sarah keeps it honest. Mrs. Penn keeps it old. Bess will run it when Anna goes to be married, which Anna does not yet know she will do, but which she will do, because the curate at the village is in love with her and is gathering his courage. Tom will be steward here in 20 years if I have any say. Mr. Latimer will not be here at midsummer," she said. "Oh," he said, "I had decided that before you came. Meeting you only made me certain." She said, "What will you tell him?" He said the truth, which is that he has been writing letters that were not his to write, and that the price of such letters, as a wise kitchen maid told him in the passage last night, is rarely what the steward expected. She looked at him. He looked at her. He said, "Sarah told me." She said, "Sarah." He said, "Sarah tells me everything that matters. She has done since I was 9. She has the bad hands now because she has worked them for 40 years in this still room. And Mr. Hollis is not a horse doctor. He is the best physician in the county, and he comes for the mare because it is the only way Sarah will allow him to look at her." She said, "You arranged that." He said, "Anna arranged it. I only paid for it." She said, "Edmund." He said, "Yes." She said, "I should like to stay another day." He looked at her, surprised, for the first time. He said, "Asmira." She said, "Asmira." "My aunt comes to the inn tomorrow evening with a letter and a trunk and a great many opinions, and on the day after that I am to come to the front door in silk, and I will. But I should like one more day in the still room first, because Sarah has not finished teaching me to bind hyssop, and because Bess has promised to show me how she counts the cream, and because Mrs. Penn called me a good face yesterday, and I have not yet earned it." He was quiet for a long moment. The first edge of the sun came over the yew hedge and lit the rim of the stone basin, and the sundial cast at last a thin, pale shadow, and the shadow moved a hair's breadth as they watched, and a robin, perhaps the same robin from the still room window, landed on the sundial and considered them with the air of a small landlord. And Edmund said, "You may stay another day. I will say nothing to anyone. You will come to the front door on the 6th day in silk, and I will meet you there as if we have never spoken. And then, after, I will tell Anna, and she will be very angry with both of us for a quarter of an hour. And then she will not be angry any more, because she will see that you knew her before she knew you, and that you came to know her on her own ground, which is a thing she will respect for the rest of her life." Mira said, "And Sarah?" He said, "Sarah already knows." He said, "Sarah has known since the first afternoon, your hand on the lavender." She said, "My hand." He said, "She said you stripped them like a girl who had been taught by someone who loved her." She said, "My grandmother taught me." He said, "The one who put the 3 girls out of the chapel." She said, "The same." Edmund said, "Ah." He said, "I am sorry about your grandmother." She said, "Do not be. She was not a kind woman. But she taught me to strip lavender and to count silver and to keep my back straight, and those are 3 things that have served me well in this house." He stood up. He held out his hand to her across the stone basin. She stood and took it. His hand was warm. His thumb passed once, very lightly, across her knuckles, where the lavender oil had stained her fingertips faintly purple, and he said, "You should go in before the kitchen wakes." She said, "Yes." He said, "Mira." She said, "Yes." He said, "On the 6th day, when you come in at the front door in silk, you will not know me, and I will not know you. We will be very correct. We will say, 'My lord and my lady.' We will do the bow and the curtsy. We will let Anna and the household see what they expect to see, and then, in the evening, after, I will find you in the long gallery, where my mother's portrait is, and I will say to you, in front of no one, that the girl in the still room had blue hands and a straight back and a grandmother who taught her well, and that I have been waiting for her since I was 9 years old, and I did not know it, because no one had told me what I was waiting for." She did not answer. She could not. He let her hand go, very gently, the way he had set the mare's hoof down on the cobbles, and he said, "Go," and she went. She walked back through the sunken garden and the orchard and the kitchen garden, and the dawn came up around her in a thin, pale gold. And as she came in at the kitchen door, Anna looked up from her list and said, "Where have you been?" And Mira said, "For hyssop, my hands were cold." And Anna looked at her face and said, and did not press. And Sarah, from the doorway of the still room, looked at her once and said nothing. And Mira sat down at the long table next to Tom and helped him for a little while with the strap, because his hands were still too small for the buckle, and someone, his lordship had decided, must teach him. And the day went on. And the next day went on. And on the evening of the 5th day, a hired carriage came up the drive with her aunt in it, and her aunt did not see her, because she was in the still room with the door closed, binding hyssop, and on the morning of the 6th day at 11 o'clock, the great front door of the house opened, and a girl in silk and pearls walked into the black and white hall, and Anna, standing at the foot of the staircase that turned twice with the rest of the household drawn up behind her, saw the girl's face and went, for 1/4 of a heartbeat, perfectly still, and then she curtsied. And the corner of her mouth moved, and behind her, Sarah's corner moved, and Bess's corner moved, and Mrs. Penn, who had been brought down for the occasion in her best cap, narrowed her eyes once and then opened them again, and the man at the top of the staircase came down it slowly, as a man comes down a staircase when he has been waiting at the top for a long time and does not want, now that the moment is here, to hurry it. And he bowed over her hand and said, "My lady," and she curtsied and said, "My lord," and his thumb passed once, very lightly across her knuckles, where there were no longer any traces of lavender, but where, she knew, he could still feel them. They were married in the spring, as had been arranged for 9 years, in the small chapel at the end of the Avenue of Limes, and Anna stood at the back with the curate from the village, who had at last gathered his courage and had spoken, and who would marry Anna himself in the autumn, with Mira as her witness. Sarah's hands were better by then, because Mr. Hollis had been allowed to look at them properly, and she lived another 17 years and taught Bess everything she knew, and Bess ran the still room until she was an old woman, and counted the cream aloud to her own grandchildren. 1, 2, 3, 4, because counting was the way one was permitted not to know. Mrs. Penn died peacefully in her sleep 2 winters later, scowling, no doubt, at whoever met her on the other side. Tom became steward at 28, exactly as Edmund had predicted, and was so honest in the keeping of the books that the tenants complained of him fondly for 40 years. Mr. Latimer left at midsummer, as Edmund had also predicted, with a small pension he had not earned and a great deal of injured dignity he had, and he wrote, for a little while, to whoever would still receive his letters, and then he stopped, because no one would. Mira's father's secretary was quietly retired by her father, who had been informed in the most courteous possible terms by his son-in-law that retirement would be more comfortable for everyone than the alternative, and Mira's grandmother, who was already dead, was unable to put anyone out of any chapel ever again, which was, on balance, a relief to the parish. And there, the fire has burned down a little while we talked, hasn't it? Come closer, if you like. If you have ever walked up a drive that frightened you, carrying something small as a disguise, and found at the top of it not the thing you feared, but a person who was, quietly, waiting to see who you really were, then this story belonged to you before I told it. Tell me before you go, which moment stayed with you? Was it the bay mare leaning into his shoulder in the yard? Was it Bess on the churn lid, counting cream the way she had been taught she was allowed not to know? Was it the coat across his arm, offered the way one offers a thing to a guest? Or was it the sundial at dawn, with the first edge of the sun on the rim of the empty basin, and the 2 of them standing on either side of it, with their hands not quite touching yet? Sit with it a moment. There is no hurry. And if, on a night like this one, you find that you would like another story by this same small fire, you know what to do. Pull the chair a little nearer, bring whatever cup is warm in your hand, and when you are ready, settle in, and we will light the next one together. Good night, friend. Sleep gently. The fire will keep.